Okay. Um. So we're going to be talking on UI UX in startups, navigating problems and challenges, right? And I want to make sure that this session, right, today's session, right, will be interactive, in a way, right? If at any point you can't hear me because my network is a bit unstable, please just feel free to interrupt me, right? So yeah, I want the session to be interactive. So it feels like I'm talking to people and I'm not just talking all through to the very end, right? So we'll be looking at this, and then some of the things would look at to be research budgets and time constraints when it comes to startups. And I mean, some of all these things we're talking about, we focus more on early stage startups, right? Startups that are still trying to like get still trying to attain product market fit, right? Very early stage startups. So research budget and time constraints, conflicting ideas with stakeholders, and then trying to balance aesthetics and functionality, and then design processes that are unstructured, and design feedback. Now, we'll look at research budget and time constraints. Now, one of the things that I would say regarding early stage startups or startups is most times there's literally no time, right, to do certain things. Um, there's literally also no budget to do certain things, right? And then when you don't have like time, you don't have budgets, it will mean that like you would not be able to do like research, right? And then we'll be focusing on research at this point, right? A lot of ideas that startup companies um, um, product, right? A lot of ideas you get from a product are based on, assumptions, right? Like at the earliest stage is based on assumptions, right? And then you want to validate some of all those ideas, right? You want to know why you're doing certain things, how you want to do that thing that you want to do for your users, right? You want to know like the approach you should take. That's one of the reasons why we do like research, right? You want to understand, the user pain points, like what do the user want, and all that. So when you skip this process, right? When you skip this stage at the early stage of um, working in a startup, right, as a UI UX designer, it becomes very difficult, right? At a point you get to realize that you don't even know who you're designing for. You don't understand your users. You don't know. You're not come up with like your user persona, so you don't necessarily have like a picture or an idea of the user type you're designing for, basically, right? And then all of these happens because there's literally no time. A lot of early stage startups, you want to very quickly launch and get into markets, right? Um, you don't have budget for certain things, so most startups will not place emphasis on or will not prioritize research, right? They might prioritize like other things, like other features that in the product, right? Research probably would be like least of their worries. So how do you like address this issue as a product designer, right? And I mentioned that when you don't do research, right, you're going to be building your product based on assumptions and personal bias. Like, oh, this is what I feel. I feel we should do this. I feel we should take this route. It's always going to be about you as a designer. I feel. And then one thing like you always need to know is you're not designing for yourself, right? You're designing for people that will use your product. Like you most probably will know it will be like the user. um, you most probably never be a user for that particular product you're designing for, but you want to design with the user in mind, right? You want to be user centered, right? That's why there's something like user centered design, right? Putting your users at the center of everything you do, right? Putting your users at the center of everything you do, not putting assumptions or putting like your personal bias, right, at the center of everything you do, right? So we want to, if you go through this route, without doing like proper research, you will find out that if you build your product based on assumptions, I think we should do this way, and then personal bias, right? So one thing that as designers we can do, right, if we find ourselves working in a startup, is to always like prioritize like users, right, at the early stage, right? User engagements. Try to engage your users at the very, very beginning when you start like the entire product development cycle, right? You want to engage your users as at the like head on, right? Don't start building and then go back and say, I think we should speak to our users now, right? When you spend like a lot of time doing things the wrong way, right? And then you can leverage on very like lean research methods, right? Like user interviews and surveys, usability testing and competitive analysis, right? So you if you don't have budget for um if you don't have budget for to conduct research, right? There are other things you can do, right? And you see like some startups, they don't necessarily like do user interviews. You probably does like a survey, push out a survey, and then expect that the survey is valid, right? And then you can act on that survey alone, right? Which is like a wrong, not entirely wrong, right? But it's a wrong way to it's a wrong approach, right, to things, right? Um, as much as possible, still try to like combine some of the surveys with user interviews, because like again, I always tell people this: the data you get from surveys, right? They are not very sometimes they are not very genuine, right? Because you have to like think about the scenario the person who is filling the survey is in, right? Someone might send a survey to me, and I'm probably like tired, right? I'm stressed out. I don't want to look at that survey. I'm just like, man, let me just select anything. You select, just to fill that survey, right? That my input is not genuine. Now imagine there are 10 people that think like me, 10 other persons that think like me, who will fill out that survey that same way. You begin to realize that the data that you gather from that survey is literally not genuine. And then if you act on that data, right, you end up not building the products that you want to build, right, for the users you want. You get. So as much as possible, you can conduct like this lean, research methods, right, and combine things like user interviews with surveys, right? User interviews will open up more like insight as to why your user think a certain way, or why they do certain things in a certain way, right? Just like to understand like the behaviors of your users, right? So combine those two methodologies, right? And you don't necessarily have to like spend so much when you're doing these things, right? So like most times you probably will spend zero naira, right? To conduct like user interviews and surveys, right? You could conduct it like virtually. There are tools like Google Meet that would help you to speak to your users virtually, right? You don't need to be like in the same space, right? Online surveys like Google Forms, Type Forms, all of those tools like are out there. So if you find yourself in a team, or in a team where like little or no research have been done, right? Or let me say no research has been done, you can leverage on some of all these things, right? And make those suggestions that, oh, I think we should do this, because it will help us better understand our users, right? And there's also tools like Maze, right, that you can use to gather like feedback, right? Um, testing, usability testing is one very crucial um, thing that you don't want to neglect when you're building, like when you're working in a startup, right? When I started out as a designer, I kind of like neglected some of all these things, right? And I'll tell you for a fact that it eventually will come back and eat you in the uh for lack of better word, right? Eat you in the ass, right? uh because you want to pay attention to the product you've built, right? To the prototype that you've developed, right? Is it usable? Can people perform certain tasks? Can people use the prototype, right? You want to pay attention to some of all those things. And then if you don't conduct like usability testing, and you just design and ship to development, by the time you start getting those feedback, right, it might be too late, right? Or it just means that you would have to like incur more costs to make those changes and then push it back to development again, right? So you want to, as much as possible, try to avoid some of all those like avoid that scenario, right? Avoid that like situation. You could use like Maze, very basic. Upload your prototype on from Figma to Maze, right? And then test that prototype. You'll get like reports where you can see like data, see where your users are clicking, see areas where your users stopped, or get more insight as to, oh, this is why your user cannot perform certain like this task, right? So you could leverage on Maze, right? And another very good thing with um, user research is for startups, right? You most times you don't have a clear early stage startup, you don't have access to like you don't have like a user base, right? You're just starting out, you probably don't even have one user. So who do you want to speak to, right? One thing you could do, you could leverage on secondary sources, right? Like conduct things like on competitive analysis, right? Where you can look at what your competitors are doing. Like one thing is for sure, right? There is no product or no idea that you want to build right now that somebody has not done, right? there's someone somewhere, right, that has probably ever done like what you're thinking about, right? So you could look at those people, right, and see how they're doing certain things, right, or see where they're placing certain things on their product, right, why they're doing all of those things, and can gather some of all this data and work on it, if you get what I mean, right? um Using rapid iterative design process, right? So basically rapid iterative design just means designing ASAP, pushing it out, testing it, getting that feedback, and iterating on it. Like that's it literally, right? So you can incorporate that into like your design. So quite a number of people would design and then wait for developers to build, right? They don't design and then test it and see and get feedback, right? Gather that feedback and work based on that feedback, right? This is very crucial, right? Everything you're doing as a designer in a start, especially in a startup, needs to be backed by something, right? That's why you hear people say things like data-driven design, right? You've gotten this data from your design, right? And then you want to scatter the data, see what your users are saying, your customers are saying, look for areas you can you can improve based off like the feedback you've gotten, right? So as much as possible, if you're working in a very tight time with a very tight timeline, right, in a startup, try as much as possible to iterate as quick as possible, right? And this is also very important because it helps you not remain in a state of perpetual development, right? You're just designing, and then like it's like a non-ending flow, right? Again, I'll use myself as an example. When I started out, I was working on a product, right? But because I was not accustomed to like some of all these like UX methodology, especially when it comes to research, I kept on like I would design something and I would change it, right? I might see something somewhere that looks way better. I'm like, oh, I like this idea. I come back to meet the team. I'm like, oh, I think you should change this, right? So I was literally designing for myself, right? I wasn't even designing with the user in mind, right? And what that led to was the team kept on implementing my designs, changing the designs, coming back to implement the changes again, and then it was, I mean, it wasn't a nice feel, if you get what I mean, right? So as much as possible, design, implement, design, get feedback, I treat work on the feedback that you've gotten, right, and then push it. Now, another thing, I don't know if you're familiar with like agile methodology, where you plan, design, develop, test, deploy, review, right? Um, if you look at design here, and then you look at test here, I want to believe like when we talk about test, right? This probably has to do with like QA team trying to like test what has been developed to see if there are bugs and whatnot. But if you look at design here, inside of design, right? So if you're working with this methodology and then you have like 4 milestones, you have to do this for the first milestone, do this for the second milestone, third milestone, fourth milestone. Once you're on the first milestone, right? I mean, and again, this helps with time. So if you work with a team that is not structured, you work in a startup because a lot of startup like there are no processes, right? Excuse me, in place. So if you work in that setting, you can recommend this methodology to them, to the team, or to your boss, right? Oh, I think we should work with the agile methodology framework, right? Where we split all of these things into like milestones, and we can track deliverables, right? If you take a look at design here, it's not just design and then push to development, right? There is design, testing, iterating, all of those things in this during this stage, right? You're doing all of those things before you can then say, okay, I mean, we've made all of these changes, we've acted based on like feedback from users. We can then like go and develop it, right? So basically, try to like incorporate some of all those terminologies, right? Even if you don't work in a startup and you work in a dev shop, right? Wherever you're working in, right? Still try as much as possible to incorporate some of all those things, right? Some of all these UX methodologies, things like research. Try as much as possible to conduct some of all these things, even in your own time, right? So you can validate like the solution or the idea you're trying to build, right? So I mentioned that I wanted this to be interactive as much as possible. So I'm going to be asking this question, and in the chats, you guys can just respond with one, two, whatever you choose, right, or whatever you agree with. Now, imagine you find yourself in a situation where there is conflicting ideas with stakeholders. What do you do? Um, would you do what what you think is best for your users, or would you do what's required by stakeholders? So let's just take like a minute to respond in the chat. So you can just say one, you can say two, and then we'll take it up from there. Wisdom said, try to find a balance if that is possible. Look, okay. Please, I need more responses between the two. Okay, if it's possible to between the two. Thank you, Wisdom. Okay, one with reason. Okay, you do what's best for your users. Um, Adam, do you want to tell us the reason? I need more responses, please. Let me get like at least 5, and then we'll move forward with the class. I'll do my best to find a balance. Find a balance between both. Okay. One, my user comes first. Some of you are giving me like textbook answers. This one says my user comes first. Okay. Understand the ideas first. Okay. All right. All right. So let's just go. Let's just go. With the webinar. Then find the common goal. Okay. Okay. That's nice. Right. So right. I mean, in startups, right, because of how things are not all that structured in a startup, you would normally like have. Okay, okay, thank you, Adam. So you would normally find that conflict between you as a designer and you as a stakeholder, and the stakeholders, right? And then in this case, the stakeholder is not just like stakeholder could be your product manager, your engineers, right? Those guys can be stakeholders, right? Your boss, right? Your guy can be can be a stakeholder. Even your investors, right? Your guy can want, or the boss can want, or the founder can want something to be done a certain way, right? Um, that's different from what you want, right? Or what you feel is best for the user. Same thing applies to investors, right? So you would need to, as much as possible, try to like find this balance, right? Between both of them. Now let's see what we can do when we see ourselves in that situation. Now, one of the things, right? Before any other thing is to us ensure that you have like a clear communication channel, right? And then you're in constant communication with stakeholders to make sure like all parties, right, are aligned, right? As much as possible before you start, say if you're working with agile methodology and you have like a milestone, second milestone, before you start each milestone, you could try to understand like what's the goal, or maybe like the entire product, like what's the goal of the product, what are the things we're trying to achieve, right? And then work with that, right? Try as much as possible not to deviate from that, right? And then this is where like your product manager will probably also come in, right? But then one, clear communication, right? Constant communication with stakeholders, keep them aligned. It could be like weekly reviews, where they get to give their feedback, and whatnot, right? Another would be like to explain your design decisions, right? And remain user focused, right? One thing I would tell people is, for a fact, is put your users first before any other thing, right? And again, that can be very tricky, right? But as much as possible, try to put your user first. Explain why you took certain decisions when you were designing the product, right? Maybe for some reason you added this somewhere, right? Why did you put it there, right? So as designers, you're not just designing on vibes, right? You're not designing with vibes that, oh, I kept this thing here, or I kept this button here because I just feel like, right? That's not valid, right? So you need to, as much as possible, to explain your design decisions, because if you think about it, some of these stakeholders, they don't know your work, right? You are the UI UX designer. They employed you for a reason, right? For you to like provide like insights as to how things should be done, right? And then you need to do the work, if you get what I mean, right? And then some of all these things that we're looking at, right? It won't be made possible. You won't be able to convince your stakeholders if they don't trust you, right? So one thing is, trust is very crucial, right? It's very, very important when you're trying to like, when they're conflicting ideas, right? Um, Next thing would be, test your design, be data driven, right? You can conduct usability testing, which is something that I'd mentioned earlier, right? You can conduct this usability testing and show the data to to your stakeholders, right? Try to convince them, right? And hopefully they trust you. You're able to convince them, right? That's a good thing. That's a win-win, right? You, in a way, you find that balance, right? And then in all of these, right? Some of all these like things that you can do feels more like, textbook, um, solutions, right? But in the reality of things, if your stakeholder wants to do something, I'll tell you to, do what they want you to do, right? So that you can get paid. And this is also the truth. Do what they want you to do so you can get your monthly salary in one piece, right? It might not look realistic, but it's just the truth. Do it, right? If they want something to be done a certain way, do it. But then what you can then do as a designer is always remember that you're user focused, right? You have your user um, at the center of everything you do, right? Your users at the center of everything you do. Now, if they say, "Oh, do certain things," you've tried to convince them, it's not working. You can tell them, "Oh, okay, this is fine, right? We can do this thing your way." But instead of pushing out all of these features that you want, why not? Why don't we just push them in batches, right? So like in versions, so we can push it out a bit. You can make it have like version one, version two, version three. Push some of those features out a bit, right? See how your users welcome that feature, right? Basically still testing again, right? See how your users welcome these features. If your users welcome it well, fine, right? Because sometimes, right, the truth is sometimes your stakeholders can say they want to do something a certain way, and then it might just work, and it's pure luck, right? It might just work. It's pure luck. It's not like the ideal way of doing things, right? So you can track it and see, oh, if the users are not welcoming that feature, right, that feature the way that the stakeholder expects, right? You can still take that data back and um, okay, thank you. You can still take that data back and back to the stakeholder, right? And tell them, okay, so this is what we're getting from our users, right? A lot of maybe like a lot of our users like are dropping off, right? It means like, oh, the approach, right, we've taken, or the approach the business is taking is not aligned with what the user needs, right? So we need to like rethink this feature, right, from a business point of view, right? So you can take back that data. But I mean, if the users were coming fine, well, I mean, you can push out the second one, see how keep tracking how they respond to some of all these features, right? So that's one thing you do, because we can say, oh, you can say it's my users, or it's my users alone. I'm designing for my users. The truth is, you're not just designing for users, right? You're designing for the person that employed you, right? They employed you to do the job, right? If they tell you to do something a certain way, and then you try to convince them, please just do it, right? But then still try as much as possible to keep track of that feature and see um, how your users respond to it. So that way you're still like user focused, you're still putting your users at the center of everything you're doing, right? So you're not deviating from that, you're still doing that. Now, so these are two screens, right? When I mentioned something about usability testings, so if you look at these two screens that are designed, they have like different layouts, right? You can find yourself in a situation where your stakeholder likes this layout, but then you are convinced that, oh, this is what's good for your users, because you can see one, two, three, the three plans at a glance, right? And on this one, you have to keep scrolling, and then maybe your users don't like scrolling. You there's that conflict, right? How do you balance this? You can conduct usability testing, so something like A and B testing, right? And see how many people would prefer this first one, or how many users would prefer the second one. So I'm not sure if you see like a lot of posts or maybe Twitter where people say, "Oh, which one do you prefer, A or B?" Right? That's literally A and B testing. But then, if you're conducting A and B testing, you want to make sure you're conducting it with your potential users. You're not just throwing it out to you know to the general public and asking them what do you prefer, right? That's not like the proper way of doing it. So you need to conduct that testing, right, A and B testing, in the ideal way, right, with your users, right, and see how what amount of users, right, are opting for the first one, are opting for the second one, and then not just opting, right? Try to get like reasons, right? Why do you choose this, right? Why are you moving? Why are you leaning more towards this design? And you can still present this data back to the stakeholder and say, okay, we've done this. Our users are saying they don't like this second screen because you have to click on monthly and select year again. It's stressful. You have to do that for all of these three screens, all of these three plans, as well as compared to this one where they can just click on the tabs and see the prices, instantly, right? So you can present that data to your stakeholders, right? So I hope we've tried, you know, to we understand, right, how we can kind of um you know deal with conflict, right, when it comes with dealing with stakeholders, right? Next thing that we'll look at, right, would be balancing aesthetics and functionality. Now, if I were to ask everybody now this question, would you rather use an app for its aesthetics or its functionality? Let me see what everybody is saying. So please just reply um, in the chat. So you can say one, you can say two. Let me know how many people would use an app because it's just aesthetically pleasing. Okay, Olaoluwa said functionality, functionality. I'm seeing a lot of functionality. This is nice. So nobody will use an app because of its aesthetics. Oh wow, both. Okay, thank you, Ruben. I think everybody is leaning towards functionality. Okay, so the truth of the matter is one thing that we need to understand. A lot of person said both actually. So yeah, so one thing we need to understand is um the aesthetics, right, is what would attract your users, right? But functionality is what keeps them, right? If I have a very shitty app, like aesthetically speaking, if I have a very shitty app, um, but a very shitty UI, right? But then it works, right? And I have another one that is very beautiful, like colors, shadows, text, is mind blowing, right? But that one, if it doesn't work, or I'm trying to like send money with the aesthetically pleasing app, and then it takes me 30 minutes to send money. But the one with shitty functionality, it takes me, you know, 30 seconds to send money. I would definitely opt for the one with very good functionality, right? Because I can perform what I want to do with ease, and which is the same thing when you apply it to like users, right? Users want to be able to land on your product, right, and use things with ease. So if you're working in a startup and then you're building screens and uh, or you're working in a startup and then your product, right? Users cannot land on your product, right, and do what they want to do instantly. It's a problem, right? Again, that does not mean that you need to just you choose an app with functionality alone, right? You also need to consider the aesthetics, right? You cannot build a product and say it's the functionality that they will chop, right? And then your aesthetics is very shitty, right? The colors is very bad. um the typography is nothing to write home about. Like it just does not make sense because a very yeah, it just does not make sense, right? So in as much as possible as designers, right, if you find yourself working in a startup, try as much as possible to combine both of them. Please don't say it's functionality I'm all about. I don't say it's aesthetics I'm all about, right? Both of them, they are very, very important, right? If you take a look at Piggyverse, if Piggyverse was not is not if the product is not aesthetically pleasing, nobody will probably use Piggyverse, right? It won't really attract users, right? It won't call for your attention, right? You probably want to download the app, right? So as much as possible, try as much as possible, try as much as possible to balance both of them, right? Build a product that is functional, and on the same side, that when users look at it, they're like, I like this product, right? Like is aesthetically pleasing. So for people that are saying functionality alone, I mean, yeah, I get that, right? Because you have to just choose one. But as much as possible, try to consider both when you're building like your product, right? If you know you're not strong on UI, if you know you're not very strong on UI, try, one listen, yeah, thank you, Wisdom. So if you know you're not very strong on UI, as much as possible, try to work on your UI, right? If it's colors, and some of these things I'm talking about are things that they um at the early stage of my career, right, that was where I had issues with. I was strong on functionality, right? I was strong on UX. Users can do this in the shortest possible amount of steps, like it makes sense. They get. I was strong on that one, but then my UI was not all that strong, right? So I had to build on it, like things like color theory, typography. I had to work on some of all those things. So as much as possible, if you know that your designs are not aesthetically pleasing, right? please try to like build on it, right? Work on it. Um, it's going to really make you stand out, right? As a designer. And next thing would be, unstructured design processes, right? So in startups, right, there's like literally no structure to it, right? Except you have a designer on board that knows what they're doing, right? So there's literally no structure to it. You would see that there's a lot of like design inconsistency. So actually, if you have like say 3 or 5 designers working on the same product in a team, right? Somebody might be using a button that is really curved. Someone can use a button that is, the edges are sharp, right? So you can get some of all this design inconsistency, right? Inefficient collaboration, because things are not structured in a way. Your developers probably cannot even understand your Figma file when you're working, right? You cannot collaborate with your developers or your product managers, or your stakeholders can't even like, come to the Figma file and understand what's happening, right? They land on your Figma file, they're lost, right? Scalability issue again. Uh, your designs cannot scale, right? Because again, there is inconsistency in your design. Now you're trying to build like a new feature, but then it's not just scaling well, or you're trying to build yeah, so like there's all that issues, right, that you can encounter when you don't have things put in place, and then it leads to like bad user experience, like in truth, right? Because when there's no consistency in your layout, in your design, um, right, like the users are just lost, right? What's going on? In the end, it leads to bad UX, and then what can you do, right? You need to as much as possible make sure that you align with the brand, right? And then if the brand, so for example, if the brand is a kind of brand that they use like a lot of pictures, right? Um, you want to make sure that when you're designing your product, right, there's that alignment, right, with that brand. You're using like pictures. If the brand color is blue, when you're designing your product, I don't want to be seeing red. I don't want to be seeing yellow, right? Make sure that like it's aligned, right? Let it be structured to what you're doing as a designer, right? Um, Build with style guides and components. And the truth is, as in a startup, right? A lot of people will say, "Oh, they're building design system," but the truth is, like you don't have that time to build a design system, right? Design system is not just style guide and components, right? I mean, but you can build, basic style guides, right, and components, and then work with that. So if you're working in a team with 2 other designers, they can leverage on the style guide and component that you've built, right? So that there is that consistency, and then you can communicate this with your developers, right? So they can see the style guides, they can see the component that you built out, and they're able to make sense of you know of of your design, right? So develop design systems, right? I mean, if you have that time, you can develop a design system. But if you don't have that time, you can leverage on open source, right? As designers, if you have access to your Figma community, you would see like a lot of design systems in Figma community, and I'm sure some of us have seen that. So you can leverage on the design systems that you see, but then again, make sure that it's suiting your brand, right? So you're not just taking that design system and you're just putting it in your design, bam, right? Because you begin to see like there are other designs right out there that begin to look like your own design. So you can leverage on that, but make sure that you tailor it to what's expected by the brand, right? And then use it for your product, for your project. Again, foster collaboration amongst them. Not just not just within the design team alone, but then with other like cross-functional teams, right? Like your developers. Ensure that carry them along as you're designing, right? It's a startup, right? Try as much as possible not to work in isolation, and that's something that you don't want to be doing, right? You don't want to work in isolation, and then when you're done working, you just push to developers. And for a startup, and if you're a designer who is just starting out, you probably most times would not have like an idea of programming, like maybe basic CSS. So you don't probably will not know what's possible within the shortest possible time, because you're working with a very tight time frame, right? You want to communicate with your developers or your PM that, oh, like, is this possible? I'm thinking of this, right? They can give you that input, and then that can influence your design decisions again. So don't work in isolation, right? Work with your devs, right? And sure, still look at what they're developing, because the truth is, and this is not shade to anybody, the truth is you can design something and your developers will give you something else, right? And then you begin to see that your design or the implementation, like there is no consistency again, right? Ensure that you are you are carrying them along, looking at what they've developed, right? And then areas where the corner radius is meant to be rounded and then it's sharp at the edges, cut them out. These things should be rounded, right? Um, Basically, just ensure that collaboration amongst them. You get so in a way that can help to reduce some of the inconsistency that you find in your design and document your design well. Do that very well. So if you're doing your flows right, do your flows well. Make sure like your developers understand what's going on, like what's meant to happen when you click on certain button or when the users go through that flow, right? Make sure that it is very, very clear. And that way it can help reduce how unstructured the entire design process is in a startup is, right? So next thing would be that we'll look at would be, I think this is the last thing we'll look at, would be like design feedbacks, right? So if you work in a startup, you would get a lot of feedback, right? Not just from your founder or your CEO, even from like your team. How do you handle this feedback as designers, right? What do we do? Go and get them. Now, one thing I advise designers very well, designers who are just like also starting out or designers generally, is to try as much as possible to separate yourself from your work, right? I know as designers, you can get attached to our work and you get one feedback and you're like, but what are you saying now? You get so if you are able to like detach yourself from your design, right? And then someone gives you like a feedback, you're able to welcome those feedback, right? And then act on it. And you don't feel some certain way regarding the feedback. If it's a positive one or it's negative, right? You don't feel some certain way regarding it. Ensure that there's a clear, feedback channel, right? How are you getting this feedback? Right? Especially in a startup, right? You can see that your CEO or your founder might comment on Figma and say, da, 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 can you change this? This. You get that feedback. And then it comes again and he sends you a screenshot to your Slack. Oh, this needs to be changed. It comes again, send you a screenshot to your WhatsApp. This is like the feedback is scattered everywhere, right? And then like there's just too much, it's all over the place and you can't focus, right? Make sure that you have all of those feedback documented in one place. So if you want to be collecting the feedback on Figma, right, make sure that you're doing that on Figma, right? You have everything in one place. When you've made like those changes, you can check it and say, oh, this has been done and whatnot, right? And again, ensure that the feedback you receive is not vague, right? Make sure the feedback is clear. If it's not clear, as much as possible, try to ask for clarity, right? Try to ask for clarity. And the reason being is you will get a lot of feedbacks like someone would say something like, oh, it's not popping, like make it pop. I don't know if anybody on this call have heard something like that. Oh, there's just something about it, make it pop, right? You get those kind of feedback and you're like, what do you want to make pop, right? So as much as possible, try to, make sure that you get like a feedback that is very clear, right? Um, a feedback that is not vague, right? It's not vague. Let your stakeholders let them be able to like communicate to you properly because you're not in their mind, right? And that's what if you find yourself in a lot of startups, you find yourself in that situation. You're not in the mind of the person, right? And you don't expect that. Oh no, or rather, they expect that you're in their mind, and then you have like an idea of what they want, and then you can just like push it out. I mean, I've been lucky in scenarios where I get feedback and I'm like, man, this feedback is very vague, but I just do what I can do based off like the feedback that I've gotten, right? And then the person comes and says, it's like you're in my head, like it's like you're inside my head when I was thinking of this idea, right? So like the scenarios like that. But please and please, right? You're not in their head though. You cannot make sense of whatever they're thinking about. Let them be able to communicate it well to you as a designer. So some of these problems are problems that you face, right? And way more than this, way more than this are problems that you face uh in startups, right? Okay, I think I'm done. So we can ask questions. If you have any questions, please let's ask.
Okay.
We still have 9 more minutes.
All right.
Okay.
All right, thank you very much, Gabriel. Guys, please let's send you those clapping emojis for Gabriel. It's been an amazing session so far. Wisdom, we've been laughing all along, and at some point, I'm almost forced to ask him, Wisdom, why are you laughing? But at some point, I think I could resonate with you. So I'm going to stop the recording right now.